Welcome back to Awake. Today we look at one of my favorite stories in all of the Scriptures. In the book of Nehemiah, we read about a man whom God used in an incredible way in the life of God's people. Many people look at Nehemiah's life and are able to draw leadership lessons that apply to all aspects of life. It is easy to look at Nehemiah as a great example of leadership, but I want to suggest to you a greater way to look at the life of Nehemiah. As great of a leader as Nehemiah was, the book of Nehemiah really begins with a focus on prayer. The unbelievable story that unfolds in the book of Nehemiah is a tremendous picture of prayer. When you begin reading the book of Nehemiah, it is evident that Israel is not in a good spot. Nehemiah's brother Hananiah gives a grim report of what is taking place in Israel. After being in captivity for 70 years, the people of Israel had begun relocating back to Jerusalem. This was happening over a period of time, and we pick up the story about 90 years after the first Jews had begun returning home. The grim report was this: the people are in trouble. The walls of Jerusalem are broken down, and the gates have been burned. The city was unprotected from outside attack. Something had to be done. As you can imagine, Nehemiah hears about the plight of the city and of the people of God and is understandably burdened. Now here's the key to the entire story, and really the key to the leadership of Nehemiah. If you think about all of the things Nehemiah could have done in this situation, he could have immediately began to try to fix the problem. He could have ordered the people to get to work right away in rebuilding the wall. Yet, here's where you see the secret to Nehemiah's leadership. The first thing he did was to turn to God in prayer and fasting. If you were to simply stop reading the book after the first 4 verses, you would be able to see an incredible principle. Nehemiah allowed desperation in his own life to drive him to a desperation for God. When you think about what people do in their own desperation, it can honestly be a bit discouraging. Many people's first response to bad things in their life is to run to a friend, run to alcohol, or run to something else to help them cope with a situation. What we learn here in the life of Nehemiah is that our first response to our own desperate situation should be to turn to God in prayer. As you continue to read throughout this passage, you see that in this prayer, he is completely shifting his attention away from his situation and fixing his thoughts on who God is and what he has promised to do. He is open about his own sins and the sin of Israel. This is a prayer of repentance. This is a prayer of desperation before God. Isaiah 26:3 says, "You will keep the mind that is dependent on you in perfect peace, for it is trusting in you." This perfectly describes the life of Nehemiah. He is intentionally moving his mind away from the chaos taking place in Jerusalem and placing it upon the God of peace. As a result of the prayer and leadership of Nehemiah, the situation completely changed in Israel. I want you to understand that the principles we see in this passage about prayer and fasting relate to our own desperate situation in our nation. We need a touch of God more than anything else. This is my burden that I want to share with you. No great movement of God has ever taken place that was not first preceded by extraordinary prayer. You may ask, well, what is extraordinary prayer? I'm not quite sure, but I know that it's more prayer than we are doing today. We need to let our own desperate situation in our lives, our churches, and our nation drive us to a desperation before God. When you think about revival and spiritual awakening, it really goes hand in hand with prayer and fasting. You see, prayer is calling upon the God of heaven to do the things that only He can do. Fasting is abstaining from food with a spiritual goal in mind. It is giving up the most natural thing our body desires, food, in order to seek God to do the supernatural within us and through us. We will never win a spiritual battle with earthly measures. The great thing is that God has given us the same tools that He gave Nehemiah in his day. It is time that we cry out to God in prayer. It is time that we respond to God with fasting. I hope the study today speaks to your heart. Have a great time with your group, and we'll see you next week.